Hi, this is Michael P. Coleman, Content Director for Brother Be Well. Thanking you for checking out this series, this trauma and healing series brought to you by Blue Shield of California's Blue Sky Initiative. Hi, I'm Michael P. Coleman, Content Director for Brother Be Well. Today, in one of a series of Brother Be Well conversations on trauma and healing, made possible by the support of Blue Shield of California's Blue Sky Initiative, we're talking about the myriad of behaviors that are often associated with unresolved trauma. As we've addressed in other podcasts in this series, trauma can prompt serious mental and physical health problems, especially if not addressed and treated. And as we will discuss today, the effects of trauma are not exclusive to the individual. Trauma can and does negatively affect communities as well. And in many cases, particularly in communities of color, that trauma has been impacting communities for generations. Well, it's been impacting communities for centuries, frankly. To help us discuss community and generational trauma, we're joined today by marriage and family therapist and Brother Be Well clinical advisor, Christian Jacobs. Christian, welcome back to Brother Be Well. How are you, my friend?
Hey, how's it going, Michael?
Really, really good to see you as always. You ready to get into this one?
I'm ready to get into it.
Let's jump on in, man. I appreciate you always. Briefly define community trauma, if you would, for the Brother Be Well family.
Sure. Well, Michael, in our community, we often mistake trauma for culture, right? So, just to give you a prime example, Kanye West, a lot of things that he's going through with his marriage, and some of the tweets and social media things of that sort. Sometimes we look at culture and we substitute that for trauma. Another example is, you have a celebrity that'll send out a toxic tweet or something, or some type of meme providing some type of bad dating advice. So a lot of times we mistake trauma, for culture. And so, I say that to say because, trauma is really an emotional and psychological response, to a traumatic event, such as violence or racism, things of that sort. So when we look at trauma, sometimes we mistake that trauma and we define it incorrectly within the community. So today I think it's really good for us to really talk about what trauma looks like, and basically, that the overview of, basically how a person experiencing that delayed shock and denial after a traumatic event is very common in those things. So I want to connect that culture part to the actual definition of trauma, because a lot of times we get it mistaken when we sometimes see traumatic things in social media and pop culture, current events, and mistake that for trauma, when it's really it's not really looking the same light.
I really appreciate that. I hadn't thought about it, mistaking it for culture. So that's an important distinction there, Christian. I appreciate it. You're going to help us break down a couple of other important distinctions during the course of this conversation. And here's one of them. When we think about violence, it's sometimes easier to picture that in your head as acts between individuals, right? But community violence is what we're really talking about today, or the effects of it. And they go far beyond the individual. Is that right? Would you say I'm right on that?
Well, that's a lot. That's really a lot to unpack, in a few minutes. But I think I can summarize some of the main points. The community violence that I think we're referring to, has lasting multi generational effect, on the individual, the person, families, and the community as a whole. So although like physical violence, amongst two individuals, whether it's a fight or things of that sort, can be lasting over time, the multi generational impact of violence is, I think, more detrimental, because a community consists of more than people, right? Cultures, subcultures, and generations. And actually, Mike, there's several layers to that community violence, right? So it's multi-layered, it's multifaceted. So we're looking at the psychological level of it, how it impacts each individual, psychologically. Then we have to look at the stigma, right? There's that that overarching theme of stigma that exists in several communities, not just African American communities, several communities. And then there's that. Then you mix in a little bit of that, the cultural norm, right? It's you're not supposed to talk about this, or it's if you're seen using medication, you're considered crazy. You're considered off your meds is a negative thing, right? Versus someone needs to be treated. And you look at or here's another one: unsaid or unspoken language, or what we call it, right? Code language, right? So you're looking at code language, like you don't say that's just something that you understand that you don't do, or on code, this is how you're supposed to act or behave. And rituals, we have the ritualistic part, right? And then we take all those ingredients, right, and then you mix that with like the cyclical trauma. So it's on a cycle. It just continues on. All the things I named just kind of continue on and keep that culture and that community of violence continuing in the community.
I got it. I got it. What would you say? We're touching on it. We're knocking on the door right now. What would you say are some of the causes of community trauma, Christian?
Well, I think there's several things to consider when you look at community trauma. For communities of color, for example, it really originates from a combination of systemic oppression and racism that existed when, back in the 1800s, when African American family, or we can even use the Irish or the Italian communities in New York, when the Depression was first, kicking off, their inability to buy homes and get good jobs, right? So they had to work the labor jobs, and they had to build, during that Reconstruction era, and early in the United States, and even further back for African Americans, for example, really started back as with slavery. And I know Dr. Joy Drury developed the term. It's called post-traumatic slave syndrome. And post-traumatic slave syndrome, it's not a diagnosis in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that's used to diagnose patients. But as a result of over 12 years of qualitative research during this thing, it was found out that this condition really exists as a consequence of centuries and centuries of slavery, followed by institutionalized racism and oppression. So a typical slave family was matriarchal in form. So the mother was in charge. The mother was the matriarch. She was the one that you would go to. In other cultures, it's the patriarch. Some Asian cultures, it's the male that you go to, or some Latino cultures, you're looking at the male to speak to. So this is where the cultural competence comes in. And then for a mother's role, was far more important than the father's role for African Americans during this time. And many fathers' names were omitted from birth records. So you have early on the deconstruction of the family, the institution of a family structure. I'm not just talking about marriage. I'm talking about a father and a mother for children. So when you have these systemic barriers, in the community, like welfare, things of that sort, you have all these different issues going on. And then also the last one really is epigenetics. Epigenetics is a new term and a new notion that's been going on for quite some time now. We're learning that lifestyle factors like diet, stress, and exercise can change the way our genes are developed, right? And how health conditions and disease can be passed down through generations. So now we have epigenetics to look at to see as a potential source of the continuation on of stress and trauma.
I plan to ask you, Kristen. That was a lot of amazing information there. I plan to ask you this a little bit later, but I want to ask you right now. We're really talking about primarily race, aren't we? When we talk about generational trauma in this country, you touched on a couple of different ethnic groups. We could certainly talk about the Native American and indigenous community, if that certainly would be for centuries, they've been assaulted and under trauma and traumatized. And so are we really in this country, unfortunately, talking about race when we're talking about generational trauma?
Yes, we are talking about race, and the thing about race is that, when you look at it, there's certain groups that have been affected by it. And so when we're trying to really wrap our brains around what race has to do with it, we're all impacted differently by trauma. No two traumas are the same. So the one community of race, of the LGBTQI community, may experience a lot of traumatic experiences through violence, as we see with some of the movements that are going on now, with underreported reports of domestic violence, which is underreported, which is a structural issue. Then we have another area where in the Asia Pacific Islander arena, where some of the families are experiencing some hate and Asian hate crime. So no two traumas are the same, but they're all related to race, and the brain does not differentiate between what type of trauma it is. It processes that trauma all the same when it comes to race-based trauma.
Can we talk about, given that, can you summarize for us, and we only have a few minutes here, but can you talk about how trauma impacts or shows up for those people living in those affected communities? What kind of symptoms or conditions or feelings or sensations might someone experience if they're suffering from what we're calling community or generational trauma?
Yeah, well, some of those things that can really show up, you're looking at several things to consider, right? So you're looking at the combination of what was impacted. So when it comes to community, sociology, we like to refer to the social ecological model, and this was created. A lot of sociologists talk about it. That framework of human development that really highlights how different environmental factors are the contributors to trauma. And so basically, it goes from a small level to a bigger level. So behaviors, are experienced individually, and then they kind of work up through the community. So you experience it as an individual, and then you create a lifestyle around it. Then it affects the community. Then it becomes a community belief. So really, behaviors are experienced really start out on an individual level. And so let's use ACEs, for example, adverse childhood experiences, as an example, and incorporate into the model we just described to get a better picture how individual trauma really turns and contributes community trauma, and basically it impacts the whole community. So as we learned in our previous productions, right, ACEs is comprised of traumatic events and childhood experiences, and that physical, emotional, and psychological issues. So all those issues that are going on kind of compound each other, and now we have one issue of an individual that's affecting the community. And now where do we go? And this is happening times 1,000, because there's thousands of children in the community. So just sit back and think how that must impact a group as a whole when each individual is going through a traumatic experience on their own.